This story goes back to when I was in 10th grade. My family and I were living in a rented house, and there was another family also renting a separate part of the house. Our landlord lived elsewhere with his children after his wife passed away, but he would come by the house daily to check on things. The landlord's wife had died many years earlier due to an infection, and word around was that ever since her death, no renters stayed in the house for long. It was her first home, and she had loved it deeply. Strange things started happening to us soon after we moved in, but at first we didn't pay them much attention. It all got worse in 2010 when we brought my grandfather, my dad's father, from our hometown to live with us. He was getting old and could no longer take care of himself. That's when everything started to unravel. For the first few days, everything was normal, but soon, Dadaji began shouting at night. He would fix his eyes on a corner of the room, screaming things like, "Go away! I'm not going with you! Leave me alone!" It was terrifying, and after that, his health started to deteriorate. There was another strange situation with the other renter. She had a habit of turning off the water supply valve for our water tank, supposedly to reduce the electricity bill. We never really understood why. Because of this, my mother had to wake up around 4 or 5 a.m. every morning to fill the water tank on the roof. One morning, while she was doing her usual routine, she saw a shadow on the roof. At first, she thought it was her own, but when she moved her hand, the shadow didn't move. She immediately panicked. While rushing down the stairs, she tripped and fell, scraping her knees badly and even losing some toenails. She was bleeding, but all she could talk about was how someone had pushed her down the stairs. It was a shocking moment, especially since my mom was always a firm non-believer in ghosts, but I could see the fear in her eyes. After this, the other renter eventually moved out, and a new couple, both doctors, moved in. They told us they had been trying to conceive for a long time, but hadn't been successful. Around that time, my grandfather's health worsened, and he had to be admitted to the ICU. The doctor said he was stable and would be discharged soon. Then something eerie happened. That night, my mother had a disturbing dream. In it, the landlord's late wife was holding my grandfather in her lap, and when she turned toward my mother, she gave her a creepy smile. 2 hours later, we got a call from the hospital. My grandfather had passed away. Not long after, my own health started to decline. I got dengue, then typhoid, and after that, I developed an allergy. Hospital visits became routine for me. Around that time, the doctor who had moved in had her own strange dream. In it, the landlord's wife was lying in bed, and the doctor was cleaning up after her as if she had wet the bed. The landlord's wife then told the doctor, "You're going to be a mother soon." The next day, the doctor came over to our place and told my mom about the dream. She described the landlord's wife in perfect detail, even though she had never seen a picture of her. My mom was shocked. After that, my mom and the doctor spoke to our landlord. They urged him to perform a puja, a ritual to honor the gods, to help his late wife's soul find peace. The landlord agreed and organized a grand puja, even making donations in her honor. After the ritual, we stayed in the house for another 6 months, and nothing strange happened. A week after the puja, the doctor found out she was pregnant, just like the landlord's wife had said in the dream. Today, she's the mother of a beautiful teenage girl. Last month, the landlord himself passed away due to old age. My mom and I still think about everything that happened in that house. We wonder if it was all real, or if it was just how things were meant to be. This happened when I was in post-graduation, during summer vacation training. The heat was unbearable, and my health took a serious hit. I was sick for 22 days straight. One day, my supervisor looked at me and said something that shook me. "Your face is turning blue, like you're about to die." I wasn't feeling well at all, and one evening, I was lying on my folding bed, completely drained. My mother was heading out to a kirtan, a devotional singing session, and reminded me to lock the door. I told her I would, but honestly, I was so weak that I didn't even have the energy to lift my hand, so I left it unlocked. Instead, I just laid there facing the wall, too tired to care. A little while later, I felt something strange. It was as if someone had come and laid down next to me on the small bed. I could feel their shoulder pressed against mine, which made me move my arm to make space because there wasn't enough room for two people. My first thought was that maybe it was my father or my uncle. They often woke me up around twilight since it was a rule in our house not to sleep at that time. Even though I was weak, I opened my eyes just a bit to see who it was. I only saw their shoulder, and they were wearing white clothes. But I was too exhausted to even ask who it was. So I turned back to face the wall and drifted back to sleep. After some time, the pressure on my shoulder eased, like the person had gotten up, and I felt more comfortable on the bed. Later, there was a knock at the door, and I heard my father's voice asking me to open it. Half asleep and still dizzy, I got up to let him in. That's when I remembered. I hadn't even locked the door. When I opened it, I noticed my father was wearing a gray kurta, not white. I thought it must have been my uncle who had come home early, maybe stopped by my bed, and then left for some other errand. But within a few moments my mother returned from the kirtan, and shortly after, my uncle arrived from work in his white uniform shirt. Relieved, I asked him if he had come home earlier, but he said no. That's when it hit me. I had been alone in the house the whole time. Things got even stranger after that. We noticed that our dog, Angel, was missing. We searched everywhere and finally found her hiding in the storeroom, trembling with fear. I picked her up and comforted her, and it took a while, but she eventually calmed down. After that night, my health started to improve. But to this day, I still wonder, was that presence beside me something divine, or was it something darker? When I shared this story with my classmates, they brushed it off as a hallucination caused by my medication. Maybe they're right, but all I know is that while you might see things during a hallucination, you don't feel them the way I did that night. You will pay for what you did. That deep, unsettling voice echoed in my dream, jolting me awake around 4 a.m. I found myself begging for forgiveness, my voice trembling as I transitioned from the dream to reality. But when I fully woke up, I was left wondering, who or what had I been speaking to? I rarely remember my dreams, but that voice always sticks with me. Every time it wakes me up, I feel like the dream is part of something bigger, like it's all connected. There's this strange, lingering sensation that these dreams are full of conflict, fights, arguments, things that make me uneasy. Was the dream in color? My friend asked when I shared a bit about my experience. I shook my head. Nah, I don't really remember. Do you have dreams that feel like a continuation of the same story? I asked her, knowing she was obsessed with decoding dreams. And, to be honest, she was pretty accurate at times, though this situation was about to take a weird turn. Was the whole dream in Portuguese? She asked, curiosity piqued. I guess, maybe, I don't remember. Are you planning to analyze my dream or something? I replied, trying to brush off the conversation. I wasn't really in the mood to dig into it. I swear I can figure out what it means if you just give me more detail. She said, almost pleading. That's when it happened. Out of nowhere, I heard a distant voice say, jamais, which means never in Portuguese. Without thinking, I answered out loud, okay, what? My friend froze, staring in a particular direction. I turned my head to follow her gaze, and that's when I saw it, a shadow moving across the room. Did that shadow speak? I asked her, feeling chills run down my spine. Hey, no, I mean, that came from you, didn't it? She replied, clearly shaken. Confused, I shrugged it off for the moment. I went out for the day, but the whole thing nagged at me. Later that evening, I decided to bring it up again, asking my friend what had really happened when we both saw that shadow. She hesitated, then finally said, "Well, that shadow? I thought I saw it come out from your back." I raised an eyebrow. "Out of my back? What are you talking about?" "Do you remember that trip we took to Noboribetsu last week?" she asked, trying to piece it all together. We had visited Hell Valley, Jigokudani, in Noboribetsu, a volcanic area filled with hot springs, sulfuric gases, and boiling water. Despite its name, the place wasn't really haunted. It was just an eerie landscape, but I remembered seeing a dead animal dangling from a cliff while we were there. We couldn't make out what it was, but it was definitely unsettling. "Yeah, I remember," I said. "The dead animal? Does the shadow you saw look anything like that?" "I think it was a bear," she said, looking serious. "And you know, in Ainu culture, bears have a special spiritual significance." I cut her off, not wanting to go down that road. "Hold on, let's not get too superstitious here. We weren't bear hunting, and I doubt a bear's spirit is haunting me. That just doesn't make sense. Ryuji, I know it sounds crazy, but the shadow was huge, and it wasn't human. I swear it came from your back." She was getting frustrated, clearly rattled by the whole thing. I was about to respond when I saw her eyes widen in horror. "What now?" I asked. She pointed behind me, and when I turned around, I saw the shadow again. But this time, I smiled. "Relax, it's just Alishani playing under the lamp," I said, referring to the cat. We both laughed, and the tension melted away. From that day on, the dreams stopped. I didn't experience anything weird, and luckily nothing bad came of it. But that shadow, whatever it was, still haunts my thoughts. Was it a spiritual experience, or just my imagination running wild? To this day, I'm not sure, but I'm still searching for answers, trying to figure out if the shadow in my dream and the one we saw in real life were connected. This is my first time posting on this forum, but I've been experiencing unexplainable phenomena for as long as I can remember. I'm here to engage with people from all backgrounds about my experiences, and I'm open to any opinions you might have. No judgment. But let me cut to the chase and tell you about the most unsettling experience I had when I was around 10 years old. I grew up with my grandparents in rural Mymensing, a place that always had a quiet, eerie charm. They lived in a tin shed house, about 100 meters away from the main road. The only way to get there was by walking a winding earthen path that curved around a deep pond and cut through a thick bamboo bush. In November of 2011, my family visited my grandparents, and one evening my dad took me to the local bazaar to pick up some groceries. After we got what we needed, he sent me back home with the bags and told me to return with some money. He wanted to gamble with his old friends. As I was heading back to the house with the groceries, I passed by the pond. That's when I heard it. A splash, but not your usual splash. It was quiet, like something slipped into the water stealthily. I paused and stared at the pond, trying to figure out what it was. The moon was out, but the bamboo bushes' shadows blanketed the water, making it hard to see. The water rippled gently, as if something had entered it and was moving around, but I couldn't make out what. After a while, I figured it was probably just an animal and continued on my way. Later that evening, the wind picked up, and the bamboo bushes swayed noisily when I walked back to my dad with the money. With all that noise, I couldn't hear much else near the pond. I stayed with my dad and his friends for about an hour or so before heading back to my grandparents' house. By then, the moon had shifted and the shadows had grown even longer. I was focused on the path ahead and hadn't paid any attention to the pond. That is, until I heard something again, a soft, deliberate step on water. I glanced toward the pond, and what I saw froze me in place. There, above the water, sat a woman. She was cross-legged, just floating above the pond's surface. Her skin was a pale, almost pearl white, glowing softly in the dark. The light that came from her wasn't from the moon. It was like she radiated moonlight herself. Her hair, blacker than the shadows, drifted weightlessly around her. She seemed to be floating without effort, just slightly bobbing up and down. At first I thought her eyes were closed, but when I looked more closely, I realized that her eyes were the same white as her skin, and they were locked on me. That's when I ran. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I didn't even trip once, which in hindsight was a miracle. I ran all the way to my grandparents' house, bawling like a baby. When they asked what happened, I panicked and told them I saw a snake. At 10 years old, it felt too embarrassing to admit I saw a ghost, a naked woman no less. Of course, they laughed at me, saying I was just scared of a snake. Looking back, maybe I should have told them what I really saw, but at the time, I just wanted to forget it. My dad came home around midnight, and he didn't see anything strange by the pond. Life moved on. In 2020, my grandpa passed away, and shortly after, my grandma decided to drain and fill up the pond. While they were digging, they found an old, rusted lock with hair tied around it, right at the spot where I had seen her. I have no idea if that's connected to what I saw, but it felt eerie, like a piece of the puzzle that I hadn't expected to find. So, that's my story. What do you think of it? Have you ever experienced or heard of something similar? I'm excited to hear how you interpret what happened. So, I've kind of learned to live with the strange things that happen around me, even though I still feel a harmful presence now and then. I don't really talk about it anymore, but it's always there. Anyway, this story isn't about me. It's about a friend of mine who recently had a terrifying experience, and I just had to share it. Let's call my friend Ellie. She moved to the Netherlands about 2 weeks ago, and was living in a temporary hotel apartment while her family looked for a more permanent home. As I type this, she's sleeping on my bed because she's been too scared to stay in that place after everything that's been happening. Ellie knows I'm sharing this, but she has no idea about my own experiences with the paranormal, and I'm keeping it that way until I trust her enough and feel she's ready to hear it. I met Ellie at school, and we clicked pretty quickly. Everything was normal between us, nothing out of the ordinary. We were even paired up for a history project that required building a model. Since she lived closer to the school than I did, we decided to grab some materials and work on it at her hotel apartment. The first time I entered her place was last Monday. As soon as I walked in, I felt it. Chills, that ticklish feeling on my skin, and the strange sensation of staring at the same spot for too long. But I've learned to shake that off after all these years, so I shrugged it off. Oddly, whatever presence I felt seemed to move away after a while, so I didn't think too much of it. That was the first time I ever sensed something in her place. Fast forward to Wednesday. We had PE before the school day ended, so Ellie suggested we go back to her hotel to take showers and get started on our project. Ellie went first while I chilled on her bed. The bathroom was right next to the bedroom, so I could hear her moving around in there. When she was done, I decided to take a soak in the bathtub and relax for about 15 minutes. She was cool with it, so I got in and somehow ended up dozing off for a bit. When I came out about 20 minutes later, Ellie had our project set up on her bed, along with some cans of soda. I laughed and asked, "Why soda out of nowhere?" She looked confused and said, "Didn't you ask for it?" I told her I didn't, but she insisted. She claimed that while I was in the bathtub, she asked if I needed anything, and I supposedly replied, "Just get the project and a can of Coke, please." Then, while she was at the fridge, she heard me shout, "Thank you," from the bathroom. Here's the thing, I was asleep the whole time. I never asked for Coke. I didn't even know she had any. We both laughed it off at first, but I could tell Ellie was a little creeped out when I told her I never spoke to her at all while I was in the bathroom. Still, we brushed it off and focused on finishing our project. Then Friday came, and things got weirder. We were at her hotel again, just hanging out and finishing up the last touches on our model. No one else was home. Her parents were out, and her older brother was at a friend's house watching football. As we were scrolling through our phones, we suddenly heard noises coming from the kitchen, like plates being shuffled around. Ellie figured her brother had come home early, or her parents had returned, so she yelled, "Me and Jess are here," and went back to her phone. But moments later, we heard the sound of a chair scraping across the floor. Ellie got up to check, but while she was out of the room, I suddenly heard her say, "Hi," from somewhere near the door. I assumed she was in her parents' room next door, so I casually replied, "Hey." Then she said, "Hi," again, and that's when I felt it. The chills, the ticklish sensation, and an overwhelming sense that something was terribly wrong. I jumped out of bed and rushed to the kitchen, only to find Ellie closing the front door. She told me she thought she heard a light knock, so she opened it, but no one was there. I asked her if she had called me earlier, and she said no. I was speechless. I told her I thought I heard her say hi to me, but she swore she never said a word. The unease was growing, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her what I was really feeling, that there was definitely something there. I was scared it might hear me if I spoke about it, so I just played it off with a laugh. By the time her parents came back around 8 p.m., I decided it was time for me to leave. I didn't want to leave Ellie alone in that apartment, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Later that night, I couldn't help but do some research on the hotel, but I didn't find any paranormal reports. That didn't mean much, though. Maybe no one had posted about their experiences, or maybe the energy was focused on Ellie and her family for some reason. Then yesterday, Ellie called me around 7:30 p.m. Her voice was shaky, and she asked, "Do ghosts exist?" I told her that I believe if there's good, there's also bad. So yeah, I think they do. Her voice cracked as she replied, "I think there's a ghost here." She explained that her family had heard what sounded like her brother crying in the kitchen, but he was in the bathroom at the time. They were so freaked out that they decided to move to another hotel. I invited Ellie to stay with me, and she's been at my house since last night. My parents were understanding, but they didn't really buy the whole ghost thing. Still, Ellie is terrified, and I think it's going to take her a while to recover from everything she's been through. So, what do you all think is happening? I'd love to hear some thoughts or advice. I've always believed in the balance of good and bad energies that exist around us, moving parallel to our lives. But from a young age, I was naive enough to ignore the strange things I sensed. I would catch glimpses of figures in my peripheral vision, feel the hair-raising coldness when something wrong was near me, but I brushed it off, not wanting to admit what I already knew deep down. The supernatural was real, and I was more sensitive to it than others. As much as I tried to bury that knowledge, it never truly left me. Eventually, it caught up with me in the most horrifying way. When I was 19, I took a job at a call center in Mumbai to help pay for my tuition. It was the only way to manage both my graduation studies and my bills, so I worked night shifts from 5:30 p.m. to 2:30 a.m. It was hard, and the atmosphere of the office was draining, cold, impersonal, and filled with tension that felt like it clung to the walls. It was 2019, and I worked in a UK-based process, so my hours synced with UK time. Friday nights were always the worst, especially when there was an R&R event. The floor would empty out early because everyone wanted to head to the party. But I wasn't interested in celebrating. I had to finish some work, leaving customer notes and follow-ups, so I stayed behind after everyone else had logged out. By 3 a.m., the floor was eerily silent. The hum of computers, once comforting, now felt like the only sign of life in the building. It was colder than usual. I blamed the AC, but the temperature had a sharpness to it, like the cold wasn't coming from the air but from something else. I shook off the uneasiness and forced myself to focus on the screen in front of me. That's when a man walked up to my desk. He appeared out of nowhere, like he had simply materialized from the shadows. His face was familiar, someone I'd seen in passing on the floor a few times but didn't know well. There was something off about him, though. His skin had an ashen tint, and his eyes, they were hollow, almost distant, like he was staring through me, not at me. He asked if I needed help. I declined, trying to be polite but also wanting him to leave. I didn't want to seem weak or incompetent, especially not in front of my superiors in this toxic, cutthroat environment. I was already on edge, trying to prove myself as a fresher. The man smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. He told me not to stay too late, that stress was bad for my health. There was something unsettling about the way he said it, almost like he knew something I didn't. I nodded and forced a smile, then went back to my work. When I finished, I looked around, but he was gone. I assumed he had left, but something didn't sit right with me. The air felt heavier, colder. The office felt emptier, if that was even possible. The next day, I logged into my shift as usual. As I checked my emails, a wave of dread washed over me. There, in my inbox, was a company-wide condolence message. The man I had spoken to the night before was dead. I stared at his photo in disbelief. He had taken his own life the afternoon before, hours before I had spoken to him. I felt my body go cold. How could that be possible? I had spoken to him. I saw him. I heard his voice. He was there, alive, just hours ago. I couldn't make sense of it. My hands trembled as I walked over to my team leader and told him what had happened. He looked at me with a smirk, like I was making it up. "You must have been hallucinating," he said, brushing me off. "That guy never even came to work. He was found dead in his apartment by his wife yesterday afternoon hallucinating. Number. I know what I saw. I know who I spoke to. The way he looked at me, the way he warned me not to stay late, not to stress. It felt real. Too real. But the more I thought about it, the more his words began to haunt me. It was almost as if he had been trying to tell me something, warn me about the dangers of this place, this job, this life. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, those hollow eyes, the way his voice seemed to echo in my ears long after he left. And then, a chilling thought hit me. Maybe he hadn't really left. Maybe he was still there, in the office, trapped in the very place that drove him to his end. I quit that job soon after. The thought of going back to that cold, empty office made my skin crawl. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man, or whatever version of him I had spoken to, wasn't at peace. The company never mentioned him again, and no one talked about what happened. But I knew the truth. His death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a warning, a reminder that some energies linger long after life has left them. Now, I can't help but wonder, was he the only one? Or are there others, waiting in the shadows, watching, waiting to make themselves known? This happened when I was much younger, probably around 6 or 7 years old. Being half Irish, we'd often visit and stay in the countryside, surrounded by endless fields, with hardly any streetlights around. It was peaceful, yet eerie at the same time. Our trips usually followed a routine: shopping, visiting family, going to mass, and this particular visit was no different. We were staying in this old cottage, the kind of place that screams haunted. It had an all-wooden interior, an old-school coal fire, basically the kind of house that made your imagination run wild even during the day. I had my own guest room in this place, which in itself was creepy. Something about that room always made me feel uneasy, like I wasn't alone. I couldn't shake that feeling no matter how hard I tried. One day I wasn't feeling too great, so I was playing quietly with my action figures at the top of the stairs. These stairs weren't the regular straight kind either. They were those winding, swirly stairs that made everything seem more mysterious. Anyway, as I was playing, I heard what sounded like my mom calling me from downstairs. Naturally, I replied, but there was no response. So I leaned over and shouted again, asking her what she wanted. Still nothing. As I turned around to go back to my toys, that's when I saw him, a cowboy-like figure standing at the far end of the hallway. My heart practically stopped. I remember being completely frozen in place, unable to process what I was seeing. Even now, I can't explain it. In full-blown panic, I rushed downstairs, expecting to find my parents up and about. But no, they were both sound asleep on the sofa. That's when it hit me hard. I was absolutely certain I had heard my mom call my name, but she was fast asleep the whole time. When I told my parents what happened, they said I looked pale as a ghost. Whatever I saw, it shook me to my core. For the rest of that trip, I couldn't sleep in the guest room anymore. I ended up sleeping on the floor in my parents' room because, honestly, I didn't want to be alone after that. It was the first time I experienced anything like this, and even now it's one of those moments I just can't seem to forget. It was the winter of 1984, a time that now feels like a lifetime ago, yet some memories refuse to fade. I was waiting for my medical school classes to begin, and to make the most of the remaining break, I decided to take a trip to a hill station about 250 miles from my hometown. My mother joined me, reminiscing about her youth spent in the same region. After 3 peaceful days, surrounded by misty mountains and crisp air, it was time to head back. We left in the late evening, my mother beside me as I drove, the car slicing through the cold January night. My mother, familiar with the area, suggested we take a shortcut home, a route she remembered from years ago. I was hesitant, but trusted her instincts. Little did I know this decision would lead us down a path I'd never forget. The road she directed me toward was desolate, a narrow stretch barely wide enough for one vehicle. Midnight was creeping closer, and the cold outside intensified, the air biting through the thin warmth of the car's heater. The road was flanked by dense bushes on both sides, so overgrown and tangled that it seemed impossible for anyone, or anything, to pass through them. My mother had drifted into a light sleep, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the eerie stillness of the night. I was driving cautiously, trying to keep my focus sharp, but suddenly something appeared out of nowhere. A man stepped out from the thick, impenetrable bushes, almost naked, his thin frame barely covered by a tattered lungi, a cloth worn by villagers in my country. He stood in the middle of the road, his face obscured by the darkness, and he raised his thumb, signaling for a lift. For a moment, time seemed to slow. My mind screamed at me to stop, but my instincts, honed by an inexplicable sense of dread, kept my foot pressed firmly on the accelerator. The car surged forward, and I sped past him without looking back. But as the man faded into the night behind me, something gnawed at the edges of my mind. How could he have emerged from those bushes, They were too dense, too thorny. Even a wild animal would have struggled to break through them, let alone a man. And why was he wearing only a small cloth, barely anything at all, in this freezing cold? It didn't make sense. A chill ran down my spine as the unsettling realization set in. Unable to control the urge, I glanced into the rearview mirror, expecting to see the empty road stretching behind me. What I saw instead stopped my heart. The center of the road, where the man had stood just moments ago, was now engulfed in flames. The fire roared, but it cast no light, no warmth. It was a flame that felt wrong, unnatural. And as I stared into the mirror, I felt something ancient, something malevolent staring back at me. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. I could hear my own breath, quick and shallow, as the panic began to set in. I floored the gas pedal, desperate to get as far away from whatever that thing was. The engine roared, but the memory of that man and the fire burned in my mind. Who or what had I just seen? My mother stirred, startled awake by the sudden acceleration. I told her everything in a rushed whisper, my voice shaking as I recounted the man, the impossible bushes, and the fire. She listened quietly, her face pale in the dim glow of the dashboard. She didn't speak, but her silence told me that something deep inside her knew exactly what had happened, even if she didn't want to acknowledge it. The rest of the drive was a blur. My knuckles were white as I gripped the steering wheel, praying we'd make it home without encountering anything else. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, following us in the shadows, just out of sight. Every bump in the road made my heart race. Every whisper of wind sent a shiver through my bones. We eventually made it home, but the experience left a scar on my soul. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find a logical explanation for what I saw that night. Maybe it was some sort of hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion and the cold. Or maybe, just maybe, I had encountered something far beyond the realm of human understanding. Some nights, when I close my eyes, I can still see that man standing in the road, his hollow eyes staring through me, his hand raised as if to beckon me back. And sometimes, in the darkest corners of my dreams, I see the flames, the unnatural, otherworldly flames that burned without warmth, lighting the way to something I dare not follow.